it's a personal joy for me to introduce Peter. I first met him in 1984, a very long time ago, but I think Peter and I clearly haven't changed very much since then. We look just as we did 37 years ago. He was always a man of great energy. And if you were to look at his biography, you will see that his energy has been undaunted right up to today with the various activities and interests that he's maintained. He asked me to keep this short, which I will do. But I would say about Peter that if you wanted to find one person who would be your sort of go-to person to ask about various aspects of theology, he would be the man. He has 3 licenses in philosophy, liturgy, and theology. So you could probably ask him any question really, and he would find an answer for you. He also worked for many years in the Vatican, and in particular, he was very focused in working with the Synod on the Laity, which was several years ago, and he was in the department for the laity at that stage, and he worked in interreligious dialogue. So I can't think of someone better really to talk in this context of a synodal church. So he now he's lectured at Heathrow College, and he's now also focused on environmental ethics. So when we think about the synodal church and the wider society, I think that sort of emphasizes that Peter's the right person to speak to us about these matters today. So I'll hand over to Peter now.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I appreciate that. And thank you all for having me. It's a privilege to be with you, quite honestly. Listening to the questions that came to Gemma, I'm quite clear that I won't have all the answers. What can I say? It's nice of David to present me in that way, but dear friends, I do not even think that I have all the answers. But I am enthusiastic, very enthusiastic about synods and synodality, and it's wonderful to see so many laymen and women joining me to look at this important subject. So I would ask now, we have there the first slide. And what I would like to say here is that the potential for development in a synodal and more inclusive way of being and acting together is enormous. On the 15th of September, 65, Pope Paul VI, who you see on the left there, established the Synod of Bishops. And let's hope and pray, and I pray with you, that synodality will be a major feature in the life of the church in the 3rd millennium. Why do I say that and pray with you? Well, firstly, because history shows that the church and mission fare better with synods than without. History shows that. Secondly, because the potential, and it is potential, under the breath of the Holy Spirit for development in a synodal and more inclusive way of being and acting together as people of God is enormous. Potential for a more inclusive way. The terms synod and council were synonymous until very recent times. And from the 2nd century onwards, synods were one of Christianity's most characteristic institutions. While there were great councils such as Nicaea in 325 and Constantinople in 381, and you can see a slide of the council there, presented as it was in that picture. And on the top right, you've got a very idiosyncratic sort of map where you can actually see Constantinople and Nicaea actually in modern day Turkey. Well, while they gave us the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed that we still use at Sunday Mass today, those are simply the highest peaks of a vast mountain range of councils and synods right throughout the 1st millennium. To put it in very general terms, the 1st millennium in the church's life was characterized, as I said, by a process that is summed up in the word synod. This synodal process sought to achieve communal discernment and agreement, often with considerable tension, on doctrinal and disciplinary matters. Seeking, this is the point, seeking the guidance of the Holy Spirit through the community was seen as the most effective way of resolving difficulties, achieving harmony, and moving the church forward. Well, while the synodal tradition in the second millennium continued, it was considerably weaker in the Western Church, following the split in 1054 with the Eastern Church than previously. To understand the synodal path that has become central to the direction which Francis is pointing the church, we need to bear in mind a crucial development. And that development is the way in which the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65, began to balance out the excessive centralization that followed the solemn definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870. And I want to emphasize 2 points that are inextricably linked. They are pillars that, as it were, underpin the synodality or conciliarity we're talking about today. The first pillar, next slide, please, the collegiality of the Pope with the bishops. It was above all Vatican II's recognition and experience of the collegiality of the Pope and bishops that drew Paul VI to establish the Synod. Now, what we see here is nothing less than the papacy in transition.
Oh, I'm not there, see.
A gradual transition.
Oh God, that's my
I
friend.
think there's some microphones active there. What we see here is a gradual transition from a monarchical papacy to an exercise of papal service and authority with and within the worldwide College of Bishops. The second pillar is the pilgrim people of God. In Vatican II's Constitution on the Church, we find a second element that places the collegiality of Pope and bishops within and at the service of the entire communion of the baptized. Speaking for the moment of the baptized within the Catholic Church. Of course, there are many baptized outside the Catholic Church. To put it theologically, this means that Christian initiation into the death and resurrection of Christ, the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist, constitute together, as it were, the primary sacrament, the central sacrament in the life of the Church, the community of Christ's faithful. And in the discussions at Vatican II regarding the Constitution on the Church, a deliberate change in the order of chapters in that document reflects something of major significance. A chapter carrying the title, The People of God, was placed before the chapter on the hierarchical nature of the Church. Now we can get a hint, just a hint, of the massive shift this represents if we remember that the 1917 Code of Canon Law described the laity as non-clergy. That means that well over 95% of the entire church were visualized as a non. And you know, it's never a good idea to approach the other by describing her or him as a non, be it non-clergy, non-white, non-black, non-male, or whatever. The Code of Canon Law has, of course, since been revised, and a new code was published in 1983. Nevertheless, the stance taken by the 1917 Code is a vivid reminder of how clergy-centered and hierarchy-centered the post-Vatican Church had become. Make no mistake, the sacrament of ordained ministry, as delineated in Chapter 3 of Lumen Gentium under the title, The Hierarchical Nature of the Church, is a necessary and given element in the life of the Church. But The balance brought about in Vatican II, and which is strongly reflected in Pope Francis's approach to synodality, is an important and indeed necessary corrective to the tendency to identify the Church with the hierarchy. Vatican II called us to see the Church as a communion of all the baptized, and to see the sacrament of ordained ministry within and at the service of the communion and mission of all those baptized with them in Christ. This points to the fundamental equality of all baptized persons, to their common dignity and their common responsibility, which grounds the differences between functions and charisms. And that change takes us away, moves us away from a pyramid view of the Church, away from a view that looks from the top downwards. It points, without negating the specific role of sacramental ministry, towards the effective participation of all in the life and mission of the Church. That is what synodality is about. Effective participation. That is the goal of Pope Francis's synodal path. That is what we must try to move towards. I would like to emphasize an important point. Just as the Church was constituted by faith, so too it is reconstituted today by faith. And that is what identifies the Christian community. Faith, prayer, and the Eucharist are therefore an essential part of synodality. Otherwise, that meaning which is constitutive of the community and the real values that motivate it will be missing. To put it in other words, the vine is Christ, and we the branches, and we will only bear fruit if we the branches live in the vine. The entire Church, while always remaining the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church founded by Christ, is now passing, like the papacy, through a particularly intense period of ecclesial transition. And Francis has chosen 3 words to express this transition and to indicate the direction of the synodal path he is calling the Church to follow: communion, participation, and mission. There is a phrase in Pope Paul's document founding the synod that is very wise. He said, "This synod, which like all human institutions can be improved with the passing of time," there you have it, there you have it. Paul's establishing of the synod was both courageous and cautious, but he knew and expected that synods and synodality would develop and flourish from that cautious beginning. As we look towards the future, it would be wise, good, to bear in mind John Henry Newman's famous sermon at St. Mary's Oscott, Birmingham in 1852. He spoke of his hopes for a second spring, but he also said that we should not be surprised if this springtime should turn out to be an English spring of bright promise and budding hopes, and yet, withal, of keen blasts and cold showers and sudden storms. And we too should be neither surprised nor disheartened, if we encounter cold showers and storms along the synodal path. The people of God are pilgrims, and the long history of the Church offers abundant evidence that the pilgrim journey can be bumpy and decidedly bruising, even to the point of martyrdom. Because we are pilgrims on our way to the homeland of the Father that Jesus has opened up to us, we must always walk in hope and never lose our trust in the promise of the God who loves us. Well, the first of the newly established synods of bishops was in 1967, and it took place in a relatively cramped space in the Vatican called the Hall of Broken Heads. I'm sure that Paul VI, who you see there, was hoping that this first synod would not end up with the broken heads of bishops littered all over the floor. That hall was in fact a place in which incomplete parts of Greek and Roman statues related to the Vatican museums had been stored, and thus the name. In the event, the 1967 synod went well. It was concerned with the implementation of matters the council had called for, just as the approval of the way the council's liturgical reform was being implemented in those years, and the request for a much needed revision of the Code of Canon Law. The Synod of 1971, however, made the mistake of trying to tackle two huge areas in a single synod. Firstly, the ministry of priests, and in addition to that, justice in the world. It was just too much for one synod, but you live and learn. And the following synod in 1974 focused on a single theme, evangelization. And that resulted in Paul VI's 1975 apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Nunciandi, or proclaiming the gospel, a document that in June 2013, the recently elected Pope Francis described as the greatest pastoral document ever written. Well, how's that for praise? The synods consisted basically of general sessions and sessions in language groups. I was present as a secretary to English-speaking language groups in those synods, the synods from 1971 to 1980, and present much also of the 1987, forgive me, Synod on the Laity. Reflecting on the progress of synods of bishops over the years, I've gradually come to an awareness of what, at least in my view, are among the strengths and weaknesses of the synodal process from the 1970s right up to the time when Francis became Pope. Among the positive aspects of the Synod of Bishops in the period from 1967 to 2013 was the fact that the synods meant bishops from all around the world met every 3 years for a period of around 3 weeks. They came to know one another and to share ideas, experiences, and hopes. You know, this had not really happened, apart from international Eucharistic congresses, in the years between Vatican I and Vatican II. And the spirit of communion and brotherhood fostered by this new Synod of Bishops should not be underestimated. Another value is that since Vatican II, the Church as a whole has again become accustomed to the idea of synods. Besides the general synods, there were special continental synods of bishops from Africa, or bishops for rather, Africa, America, Asia, Oceania, and also particular areas such as the Middle East. John Paul II held no less than 16 synods of bishops of various kinds. Furthermore, the themes of the various synods point towards a whole series of really important questions in the life of the Church that were in many ways deepened and emphasized in the course of the synods. I've mentioned, even if far too briefly, some of the real strengths in the synods from 1965 to 2013. However, even before the turn of the millennium, many felt, where the synods of bishops were concerned, that a degree of stagnation had set in. New energy and further development were needed, and that is precisely what Pope Francis has brought. If you could carry on, Anita, to the next slides. Okay. It was widely felt among bishops and their episcopal conferences that one of the real problems of the synods was that they did not reflect an effective expression of collegiality of the Pope and bishops, a feeling that actually they were run, the program, the agenda, and the follow-up by the Roman Curia rather than the bishops. And you can see there a picture actually from Latin America, Council of Latin American Bishops. And in the picture, third from the right as you come in the front row, you have a man called Bergoglio, who was very aware of what he considered this lack of collegiality. For Francis, Jesus Christ, if we can carry on, Anita, carry on, carry on, carry on. For Francis, Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, is the center of synodality, not the church. And we must avoid the danger of synodality becoming a narcissistic preoccupation with the church itself. And using the image of sun and moon, Pope Francis stresses that Christ is the sun, and the church, like the moon, reflects his light, not its own. Before all else, says Francis, the gospel invites us to three things. Firstly, to respond to the God of love who saves us. And secondly, to see God in others. Third, to go forth from ourselves towards the good of others. Back one slide, Anita, please, back one slide. With the election of Pope Francis, and that's the text you see in the slide, which comes from Pope Francis's speech commemorating the 50th anniversary of the institution of the Synod of Bishops, that expresses beyond any shadow of doubt the importance he attaches to synods and synodality. It is precisely this path of synodality, he says, which God expects of the church in the third millennium. Next slide. Next slide. Central to synodality for Francis are the collegiality of Pope and bishops within and at the service of the participation in communion and mission of all the people of God. In the preparation of the two-stage synodal process of 2014 and 2015, Francis began to focus on the lack of effective collegiality head-on. He deliberately strengthened the Synod Secretariat while ensuring that it was responsive to him and the Synod Council of Bishops rather than to any curial department. The Synod Council is actually elected by the bishops of the world at the end of each synod. And there in the slide we have before us, we can see that Francis sees synods themselves. Back one slide, please, Anita. He returns again and again to three words, seeing synods themselves as a process rather than an event, a journeying together, laity, pastors, Bishop of Rome, which is an easy concept, he says, to put into words, but not so easy to put into practice. And three words sum up for him the path synodality must take. As you see on the slide, listening, paresia, which means boldness or frankness, and discernment. Next slide. A listening church, which means everyone involved in the synodal process must begin by seeking in faith and in prayer to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. And this requires a desire and readiness to listen to each other, mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. Next slide. I think we're slightly out of order with these slides, and therefore, please bear with me. We'll leave that slide where it is for the moment. But what I wanted to say here is that real and effective consultation is a necessary dimension of mutual listening. This is important. One of the repeated criticisms of the earlier synods had been that while there had been consultation on this or that synod, and the one on the laity, for example, in 1987 had been quite fruitful in a number of countries, on the whole, the consultation was by no means as extensive or thorough as it should have been. And that is why Francis is determined to put wide and effective consultation front and center. It is here, above all, that the pastors must listen, really listen, with open hearts and minds to the voice of the lay women and men who constitute the vast majority of the people of God. For example, the 2014-2015 synod process, with the attempt to have wide and intensive consultation before the 2014 extraordinary synod, and then again before the 2015 synod that followed as part of the process, were far wider than any preceding synod consultation. And a really serious attempt to achieve wide consultation before the Youth Synod in 2018, and again before the Amazon Synod in 2019, reflect the priority Francis has sought to give to this listening process. But this is an area, I think, that needs really thinking and working through. And I do not think that as yet it has been developed sufficiently. It is essential to keep working at this challenge of consultation, if by God's grace, synodality is to realize its full potential. And speaking of lay voices at the synods, I vividly remember Pat Jones, who will speak to us this afternoon, delivering a speech during the 1987 on the laity, with John Paul II listening at her side. I've learned to avoid attitudes, she said, in the language of us and them. And I've learned, she said, that together we can share responsibility, criticism, and praise. Share responsibility, share criticism, and share praise. Wise words. They can help us to avoid falling into a never-ending refrain of, why don't they do this or that? And now we come to actually this slide, which somehow came up at this point. And actually, I love this slide. It's to do with paresia. You're listening, and secondly, paresia, which means boldness, frankness, or honesty in speaking out. And this slide, which shows Malala, the young woman from Pakistan who was shot in 2015, it shows her a year later at the United Nations. You have the UN Secretary General there on the left, Ban Ki-moon, speaking with paresia, honesty and truth before the synod. One of the things I love about this slide is not only that it exemplifies what honest, frank speaking from the heart and deep spirit means, but also a reminder that the Spirit of God blows where it will. Here we have a young Muslim women giving witness to the presence of truth and courage in our world. Well, paresia is a word that actually means that, boldness or frankness. Now, the relevance of this point is that in previous synods, a considerable number of bishops had felt that an honest expression of their views would not be welcome to the Pope or the Roman Curia. Francis has made his views on this very clear. In words that combine the way he saw real, genuine listening on one side and speaking openly and frankly on the other, as two necessary sides of the same coin, the Pope referred at the beginning of the 2014 Synod to a letter that a cardinal had written to him. The cardinal said in his letter, some cardinals didn't have the courage to say certain things out of respect for the Pope, believing that the Pope may have thought differently. That was not good, said Francis. That is not what synodality is about. We must say everything we need to say in the Spirit of the Lord without pusillanimity and without fear. At the same time, we must listen humbly and embrace with an open heart what our brothers tell us. And these two attitudes express synodality. The participants in the synods, insist Francis, and I think we can extend this not only synod of bishops, but throughout in consultation, must express themselves honestly and without fear, and always, of course, in love. On to the next slide, discernment, about which Gemma has spoken this morning, and I will not attempt to repeat things she said, interesting and very well. One of the criticisms that had been expressed about the way actual synods took place was that for almost 10 days to 2 weeks, the participants used to sit listening to a long series of speeches of their fellow bishops. And this curtails the opportunity for real exchange. In the 2014-2015 synodal process, Francis asked the bishops to submit their speeches 2 weeks before the actual synod. And these were then combined into a working paper that itself became the basis for discussion. At the 2017 Synod on Youth, Francis made a further change. He's gradually seeking to improve and develop the synods. He introduced a brief period of 3-minute silence and quiet reflection after every 5 speeches. And that was a change that helped foster an atmosphere of listening and reflection, prayer and discernment. The next slide. Discernment also has to do with the balance between the center and the peripheries. Even if there's always an aspect of discernment that brings an inevitable tension between tradition and innovation. And it has to do with the challenge of maintaining, on the one hand, identity and fidelity to the Church's apostolic origins, while adapting to new situations and responding to new insights. And as it has in this slide, and there you've got a picture of the center, as it were, the St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican to the right, and then images around the world of different, if you like, peripheries, different realities of the Church in different places. So discernment also has to do with the balance between the center, which must offer firm but perceptive guidance, and the various peripheries responding to pastoral situations. There has to be that balance. And John O'Malley, a Jesuit historian who has studied the Church's councils long and hard, offers thoughts here that are apposite. Every institution, he observes, needs firm guidance from the center and a firm hand at the helm. For the institution to remain vital, however, the authority of the center must be balanced by a periphery empowered to act on its own authority. If the balance between these poles is lost, it will almost inevitably result in either stagnation on the one hand, disarray on the other, or in extreme cases, dissolution. I'll stop here because I said I'd try to keep within 25 minutes. I apologize if there was slight just lost there of the slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a very comprehensive exposition, and I know that the questions have been coming in, so I will hand over again to Alex, and Alex will give us the 2 or 3 questions, and we have about 15 minutes on this before we go to workshop. Alex, over to you for the first question.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Peter. And your last reflection on discernment between the centre and the peripheries was particularly interesting. You experienced, Father Paul asked, you experienced the life of the Church at home and in Rome before, during and after the Council. Why has it taken so long to get to this point in its journey, i.e. only now over 50 years since the Council?
Now that is a huge question. I gave a talk the other day at the Margaret Burford Institute in which I talked about the period of the 60s in which those first synods were taking place. It was a synod of enormous ferment. In 1969, which was the synod when they had looking at the relationship between primacy and episcopacy, there were groups of priests who by that time came to Rome to have an alternative synod. It didn't really amount to much, but it reflects what a man called Peter Hebblethwaite, I don't know if any of you ever remember him, Peter Hebblethwaite, a book at that time called The Runaway Church. And with extraordinary speed in the second half of the 60s, the turbulence, that time of revolution, Paris of 1968, all that was going on in China, the whole reaction to Vietnam, the United States, and all the turbulence that was going on in Latin America, North America, and Europe, and also over in Asia, fed into the general atmosphere of turbulence which Vatican II had already begun to create. So that we, for example, within the churches of Belgium and Holland in particular, but also to some extent Germany and France, etc., you had a tremendous explosion of turbulence. And in that period, between 1969 and 1973 especially, literally thousands of priests left the priesthood, thousands of religious came out of their convents or religious houses, and it was experienced a time of real tension, following also the publication of Humani Vitae in 1968. That experience left, I think, some of the bishops, for example, I'm thinking of Cardinal Ratzinger, who had been teaching at Tübingen in Germany, but where a sort of semi-rebellion among the students led him eventually to leave Tübingen and go to teach somewhere else. There was an experience there of what was happening in the church, which left some, I think, almost burned, if that's the way to describe it. Certainly my experience meeting some of the people from those regions, the bishops in those years. So that when you come into the 1980s, let's take the Synod on the Family, mustn't talk too long and answer to one question, but the Synod on the Family, for example, in 1980. Before the Synod, and actually later in the Synod, Pope John Paul made clear that he did not want to have change either on the question of artificial contraception, nor on the question of access of the divorced to the sacraments. That was more or less excluded. And so there's quite a lot of tension, some bishops feeling they couldn't speak openly. And then, of course, in the late 70s and the 80s, you've got the whole reflection, the reality of discussion of a liberation theology that was going, especially in Latin America, but also to some extent in Asia. And that, I think, given the experience also of a man like John Paul II, who had the experience of the communist government in Poland seeking to crush the church and divide it, made them stress, both John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, I think, who became Benedict XVI, an awareness of their need, as they saw it, to maintain very strongly a unified church and a church where there was strong discipline. And I think it's in that atmosphere that while John Paul II really believed, for example, in synods, it was not actually something where the bishops themselves actually ran the synods. It gradually came to be taken over by the Roman Curia. So there was a period, I think, where against the reaction that had been in the 1960s and 70s, early 70s particularly, there was a tension to hold the church, as it were, in a certain degree of unity rather than dissolution. That's one of the elements which I would suggest in answer to that question. And it's to do with the way you see the church and how you see the role within that of magisterial authority. What Francis has done is to recover that fundamental concept within Vatican II that the ministry must be exercised, I repeat it again and again, within and at the service of. It's very much away from structures of superiority and subordination to an atmosphere where all together are the people of God, in which, yes, obviously there is a need for apostolic authority, as seen in the bishops and with them the priests, etc., but exercised in a way that allows the voice of the laity, etc., in different parts of the world to be expressed. So you've got that as it was. Francis is doing his best to make this a more horizontal and less vertical church. I think I better stop there, otherwise it becomes a separate talk. But it's along those lines that the church reacts at the time to a situation, and then it's eased, etc. And you've got fundamentally different views of how the church should be. Sorry if that's too long. Sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, a lot of us got excited by Vatican II, and obviously you lived through it. When we come to have a Vatican III, who's going to be left behind to get excited and enthused by that and to make the synodal process something that continues?
Wow, that is crucial. I would like, I've been thinking about a question that was raised when I gave a talk the other day, and that is what is Francis really seeking to do with synodality? Someone raised a question, the talk is given from the States. Well, what's its focus? What's the focus of this thing of synodality? All the others have been either about catechetics or about the family or about bishops or about the Eucharist. Francis is focused on a process, synodality, not a particular focus. He's trying to express the fact that he's after a way of being church, a style of being church, if you like. So that the way, a style of being church is to find what we are attempting to do in this ACTA conference, of people listening to one another, of people talking to one another and reflecting together and seeing out of that what priorities gradually emerge. But I think beyond that question of process, there's also another thing. You kindly sent from ACTA the speech the Pope gave on last Saturday, actually opening the synodal process. And he said something there. He said, the words communion and mission can risk remaining somewhat abstract unless we cultivate an ecclesial practice that expresses the concreteness of synodality at every step. Now that means, as he said later, if we want to speak of a synodal church, we cannot remain satisfied with appearances alone. We need content, means, and structures that facilitate dialogue and interaction within the people of God, especially between the priests and the laity. And that takes me to this, that what this ACTA National Conference can also help mean is that we move from the understanding of what synodality is about as a style of being church to the actual experience of synods, where we find, with all the ups and downs and ins and outs of meetings between us all, what are the things that work and what doesn't. But working at it together, the only way to do that is to actually have synods. And that's why personally I'm delighted, and I'll be here to listen this afternoon, that we're having people from the Liverpool Synod describing their experience. I don't know what in that is really, really good and what can be improved, but the fact that it's happening is a way of saying, okay, this is what we've done, reflecting on that and actually doing it. How can we see to what extent that expresses the involvement of all through a genuine, effective participation, so that the voice of lay women and men is really heard. And then later, as Liverpool intend to do, when you put that into a pastoral plan, in other words, okay, the Synod says this, we will in the light of that try to do X and Y. Then after a time, it makes sense as a same church to come back again when life is changing, other challenges come up, to say, well, okay, we focused on X and Y, how did we do? And what we can learn from that? Can we improve on it? And now we've got other challenges which have come up unexpectedly, like the horrific abuse scandals that have hit the church again and again and again over the last 20, 25 years. I just give that as an example. It goes from the grasping the idea of process to actually making participation effective within communion and mission, then actually doing it. I better stop talking.
Thank you. Thank you. Should this synodal process, asked Jonathan, include all the baptized, including Christians outside the communion with Rome?
That's a huge question. Many of these things, actually, Alex, I don't have the answer. I just give my own response. I would say there are two different things. I was present a couple of times, actually, at the Synod, as they call it, of the Church of England, and very interesting process when they were looking at their liturgy and so on. And we certainly should have contact with the other churches. By the way, synod or synod can mean very different things around the world. Even in the Anglican Communion, if you go to Nigeria or Uganda, the way synods are run is very different from what synods mean in the Church of England or in New Zealand or in Australia or the United States or Canada. You've got here the huge difference of culture that comes in. So we can be present at that and have dialogue with them. But we need, within the Catholic Church, we need to have ourselves to go through our own renewal. This is my view. Again, I don't have the answer. We need to go through our renewal of putting this into effect. It's taking time and will take time. So we can have contact between one another, but we really need to do it within our own church.
Thank you. Mary Ring asked the question, Jesus never ordained anyone, ever. Isn't the distinction between laity and clergy at the heart of almost all our present troubles?
Oh, wow. You certainly get some questions. Jesus certainly left apostles who, as you see, even from the Council of Jerusalem, that so-called Council of Jerusalem you find in Acts 15, when they came together to discuss whether or not the early converts would have to adhere to Jewish practices or not. And the discussion there, that they were all involved, the elders and the people were all involved, but within that there were apostles leading it. And at the end, and Peter spoke his experience of Cornelius, you remember, earlier in Acts, he spoke there about that. And then at the end, the Apostle James said, well, we've listened to all this and heard people's views. So in the light of that, we from the Holy Spirit say, let these people in. So right through, this would take us into history, right through in answer to Mary's question, there's been the reality of apostolicity, apostles and their responsibility and role within the Christian church. But it did reach a point of, and I tried just to express it briefly in this talk, but very much particularly after Vatican I, but even before, a point of separation in church structures between people and the pastors. And that's what we must work to overcome. But yes, I do believe that ordained ministry, within the understanding of what apostolicity means, we don't have time to go into that now, what apostolicity means in the church, would take us to recognize the reality of ordained ministry. But sometimes the way it has developed has become distorted. And that's what we're trying to overcome in this present approach.